Hi there, welcome to this video where we're going to be showing you how to grow the amazing lion's mane mushroom. The lion's mane mushroom is incredibly popular right now, and I don't think it's just a fad either. I think it's more a case of people just suddenly realizing how amazing it is, combined with the fact that it's more readily available. And that's really down to the fact that both small and large-scale growers are growing more of it than ever before, and there seems to be an ever-increasing demand for it. So why is it so popular? Well, it's absolutely delicious to eat for a start, but it's also believed to have a whole host of medicinal benefits, including generative nerve growth in the brain, improving focus and mental clarity, reducing inflammation, boosting the immune system, protecting against cancer, improving heart health, and alleviating anxiety and depression. That is a pretty impressive list of benefits. We'll do a separate video about the medicinal benefits of lion's mane sometime in the near future, and you can watch that video there as soon as it's ready. But in this video, we want to specifically focus on how to grow lion's mane.
So lion's mane mushrooms are obviously fantastic, but they're also relatively easy to grow. So as a beginner, you can have some success straight off the bat. And if you're a more experienced grower, do hang around, because I'm sure that you'll learn something new about growing lion's manes in this video. So why are they so easy to grow? Well, they're not particularly fussy, they're really fast, and they grow a bit like other gourmet mushrooms. So it's easy to get some experience, transfer that onto lion's mane mushrooms. Now, let's look at how you can grow them. So firstly, in this video, we'll start with the easiest way of growing lion's mane mushrooms, and then we'll delve into more detail. We'll look into how you can make your own substrate blocks as well as your own spawn, and we'll even cover whether you can grow lion's mane mushrooms using low-tech techniques. So first up, if you don't have much experience growing mushrooms, it can make complete sense to buy in a fully colonized, ready-to-fruit bag. In this case, you want to be looking for a lion's mane grow kit or a substrate block that has lion's mane mycelium in there. They look a bit like these, and I'll tell you what to do with them next. So this bag you can see here is fully colonized and it's ready to fruit. So what I'm going to do first is cut a little hole at the top here, push out all of the air. And then what you'll need to do is cut a 5 to 10 centimeter slit in the bag. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut them slightly diagonally, 2 slits here, and then I'm going to tape them up. So this is important to stop fruiting bodies from forming inside the bag and forcing them to grow out of the place you want them to. And some growers like to just open the top of the bag and allow the mushrooms to form there. Now, this can lead to a faster harvest time, so especially if pins have already begun forming on the top of your bag. So if you're in a rush, then this could make complete sense. But in our experience, fruiting from the top of the bag also leads to a lot of wasted spongy-like growth, and also smaller and less dense fruit bodies than you would when you fruit in this way with the 2 slits on the side of the bag. So when you fruit this mushroom like this, you get these lovely dense and really meaty, lovely lion's mane mushrooms. And when you have a smaller bag, 1 slit will suffice. When you have a bag like this, 4.5 kilograms of substrate or so, I think it's best to use 2 slits in that bag. Now, where you position the slits in the bag, that depends a little bit on your own preference as a grower. As I already mentioned, you can fruit them from the top. We prefer to fruit them from the side, like the front and the back, but you can also use the narrower sides of the bag as well. Much will depend on your preference as a grower, and also how you've got your racks positioned and what works best for you. What I will say, however, is that you do want to cut the slits at a sufficiently high level so that the mushroom, when it fruits, doesn't touch any of the racks or the bottom of this meller machine, for instance. You can see these are slightly higher, so there's no risk of it touching the bottom of this machine. If you look at that bag there is obviously, those slits are quite low, so it drops down enough to touch the bottom. Not in this case, because they're stacked on top of each other, of course. So now we've covered how and where to cut your slits, it's time to move on and look at what fruiting conditions these gorgeous mushrooms need.
So first up, you can grow lion's mane just at home on the windowsill if you then take good care of spraying it with water on a regular basis. However, if you live in an area that has dry air naturally already, you might find you get substandard results like that. You'll get lower yield, your mushrooms will begin to sort of brown a little bit as they're starting to dry out. So if you can produce the right fruiting conditions, you're going to get a much better crop. You don't need a big fruiting room like this though. You can do that in a much smaller shotgun fruiting chamber, for example, or a Martha fruiting tent, or even the meller like this little device that we have here. So here's the lowdown on the ideal fruiting conditions for lion's mane. You want to have some light between 500 and 1000 lux, humidity between 85 and 90%, plenty of fresh air, bringing the CO2 level down to between 500 and 1000 parts per million, and temperature around about 15 to 24 degrees Celsius. And that's really going to vary a lot per strain. Some will grow at cooler temperatures, some will grow slightly warmer as well. So in terms of when to start the fruiting process, well, your substrate block is fully colonized when you see a thin layer of mycelium across the whole block with a slightly thicker, fluffy mycelium starting to form on the top of the block. Now, lion's mane mycelium is much thinner than most other popular gourmet mushroom varieties, and if you're used to growing something like oyster mushroom, then you'll probably think something's wrong and that your spawn is really weak. But don't worry, this thin wispy mycelium is typical of lion's mane, and most newcomers tend to wait too long to initiate fruiting. It's not a big issue, but if you wait until you see lots of pins already forming on the surface of the substrate, this is slightly too long and some energy will be wasted on pins starting to grow that won't get a chance to mature. So if your block is fully colonized and you're starting to get that thicker mycelium on top, it's time to go ahead and cut the slits in the bag. So you can see on this one here, we've just started to cut the slits here. And already after around about 3 days, and it can take 3 to 7 days roughly for the pins to start emerging, you start to see little tiny pins starting to form on the bag. Within a couple of days, those pins are then starting to grow out from the holes in the bag, and they'll just continue like that over the next 5 to 10 days. So you can see we've got one here that's a few days further on again, as they're just starting to enlarge outside of the bag. And they'll continue like that for around about 5 to 10 days until you get to the point of full maturity. And the way to tell that really is just judging by the spines on the fruit body. You can see that they've started to enlarge and drop down. The mushroom feels like it's loose on the bag and it's actually ready to come off at this point, and you simply just put your hand in underneath, give it a twist, and it will come off the bag very easily. If you feel like there's a lot of resistance and it's not coming off, then it's not quite ready for harvest yet. Now, knowing exactly when to harvest is just something you learn with a little bit of experience, but what you're looking for really is just, if you leave it too long, then you'll start to see that the spines themselves, they drop down really too far, they sort of thicken and become a bit wider like this, and the fruit bodies themselves become less dense. At this point, they're not as good to eat, they're still pretty good, but they're not as really at their optimum. And the shelf life is going to be much shorter as well. So you really want to try and get it 1 or 2 days before they end up in a spot like that. So these are on their second crop here, and you tend to get around about 2 to 3 crops of lion's mane and a yield of about 25 to 30% of the wet weight of the substrate. Eric is going to take a look now at how to handle and get those further crops.
So a decent quality substrate block like this should give you at least 3 crops of lion's mane mushrooms. And most commercial growers will probably opt to just use 2 flushes, and that's because they optimize for the growing space that they've got. Because of diminishing yields, they just make an assessment and feel like 2 crops, that's enough, and now I need to put higher yielding new blocks in. But if you're not so fussed about optimizing for space, but you want to optimize for yield, it makes complete sense to go for 3 flushes, 4, or maybe even push to 5 crops. So to get your next flush then, what you want to be doing is cut a section in a different part of the bag, a part of the bag that hasn't been exposed yet. So you could flip it over, you could use the back of the bag, you can use the bottom of the bag, whatever suits you best. And then you wait for 1 to 2 weeks before little pins start appearing, and then you're back into the cycle of nurturing your next crop. So I hope you feel really inspired to grow some lion's manes yourself. And I've got some tips with regards to the fruiting stage of lion's mane mushrooms. And the first troubleshooting tip I've got is, if you can look at these mushrooms, you see some pink discoloration. And that is really because these aren't being fruited in the ideal temperature conditions. You can see on the temperature gauge, it's only 13 degrees centigrade at the moment here. And that often leads to this sort of pink discoloration. So the next tip is that when you see brown or yellow coloration, that can be a sign of low humidity or windburn. So for instance, if it's positioned close to a fan and there's draft, that will affect the bag. The other one is if you see coral or branching shape, then that indicates high CO2 in your fruiting room, so a need for more fresh air, or it can also be a response of the bag to humidity being too high.
So making your own lion's mane substrate blocks is obviously a step more complicated, and you're going to need a few extra bits of your setup, which you won't need if you're just fruiting a ready colonized block. In particular, you're going to need to have a way of sterilizing your substrate and a nice sterile space like this in order to inoculate in. So If you don't have that, I'd recommend just starting off with a block, but if you do have that and you want to get into growing lion's mane, here's what you need to do. Lion's mane likes to grow on a predominantly hardwood-based substrate, either supplemented at around about 20% with something like bran, or a lot of people like to grow also on the master's mix, which is 50% soybean hulls and 50% hardwood sawdust. Both these substrate types work really, really well for lion's mane. In order to prepare your substrate, you simply need to hydrate it to around about 60%, load it into your growing bags, and then place them into your sterilizer vessel. Maybe you've got an autoclave, could be a pressure cooker, or perhaps you've got an atmospheric steam sterilizer barrel. All of these methods are going to work well. If you're using a pressure cooker or an autoclave, you need to run the cycle for around about 2.5 hours. That will be sufficient to sterilize the substrate. And if you've got an atmospheric steam sterilizer barrel, that's going to be a longer cycle of around about 12 hours that you'll need in order to fully sterilize the substrate. Once the sterilization cycle has finished, you then need to wait for the substrate to cool down to below 35 degrees Celsius. And at that point, you can then introduce the spawn into the substrate in a sterile space. You want to use around about 2% spawn to substrate ratio. Mix the whole bag up, seal it, and put it into your incubation space. And lion's mane is a pretty fast incubator. Does depend a little bit on the strain, but for most strains, they're going to be fully incubated in around about 12 days or so. There are some strains that take a little longer. They're going to be more like 18, 19 days, but most are pretty fast growing. And you can tell when it's fully colonized because the whole block will be covered in a very thin layer of wispy mycelium, and you'll start to see just a slightly thicker layer of mycelium forming on the top of the block. That's the ideal time to put it into the fruiting stage. So earlier on in the video, Eric mentioned we'd also cover if you can grow lion's mane in a low-tech, non-sterile way. And I have to say, it's not the easiest way of growing lion's mane, and that's, I think, because the mycelium on lion's mane is thinner, more wispy, and not as aggressive as something like an oyster mushroom, which does grow pretty well in a non-sterile way. Lion's mane, and we've done many trials with lion's mane, seeing if we can find a way of developing that's sort of feasible to grow. And what we found is that you really need to have a much higher spawn rate in order for that to work. So you can grow lion's mane in a non-sterile way on hardwood sawdust just by adding a lot of spawn. And by a lot of spawn, I'm talking about 30% spawn rate or above. And that's probably not really affordable to do for most people as an ongoing method of production. But if you're at home, you want to grow lion's mane, you don't have a pressure cooker, it's certainly one way that you can go about it. So for most growers, we always recommend buying your spawn in and just focusing on substrate and fruiting within your farm. But I know a lot of people also do like to mess around with this at home on a smaller scale. So if you want to produce your own lion's mane spawn, it's pretty much the same process as it is for any other gourmet variety. You need to start with a culture, either on a petri dish or maybe you have them in slants. You're going to take a small piece of that material, put it onto an agar plate, wait for that to grow out, and then transfer that into jars of grain and then bags of grain. You can also use liquid culture. So maybe you buy a liquid culture syringe, you can introduce that into a jar of grain, wait for it to fully colonize, and then expand that on to 10 to 20 times more grain in bags. And that will create your grain spawn that you can then use to add into your substrate blocks. One final thing to note when you're making your own lion's mane spawn is, as I've mentioned already, the mycelium of lion's mane is really thin and wispy. So if you look at your agar plates or your jars and you think, oh, this isn't really taking off, don't worry, that's entirely normal. That's just what lion's mane mycelium looks like.
Wow, so we've covered so much information there, and I hope you found it really useful. And we'll be growing lots of different types of varieties of mushrooms and going into great detail in new course lessons that we'll be developing. So if you are a course member, keep your eyes peeled later on this year for those lessons coming your way. So what we'll be doing at this farm is growing lots of different varieties and documenting it. And I hope you feel inspired to grow some lion's manes yourself, to eat, maybe dry them, or maybe make tinctures out of that. We've got a separate video on how you can do that here too. So thanks a lot for watching this video. Let us know in the comments below if you're going to give growing lion's mane mushrooms a go. Thanks a lot again, and we'll see you in the next video.